do take a seat because we're going to start this panel now. We're here to talk about the road for fintech for the next, I guess, 4 years and beyond. Obviously, we're speaking at a time when geopolitical turmoil is definitely something that's rocking everyone's businesses, and I think that's kind of the theme for what we're going to discuss today, as well as innovation in general. So we wanted to start with a question that looks at how much is what's going on in the world right now affecting your businesses, and how much is that idea of sovereignty and resilience really important to how you develop the infrastructure for your businesses? I know, Iana, this is something that you wanted to speak on, so why don't you go ahead? And also introduce yourself to the room.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good morning, everyone. My name is Iana. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of OpenPayd. OpenPayd is a B2B payments infrastructure provider. First of all, Janine, the Innovate finance team, it's an absolute pleasure to be here again for yet another year of great conversations. Absolutely fantastic to see all the energy in this room, first of all, this morning, to see the attention both from policymakers and from government on the sector, and also to see all the drive for change and the drive for innovation. So very delighted to be here today and to tackle, Emily, your first question. So the question about the importance of fintech, I think fintech and financial services infrastructure has been a driver for growth. And in previous years, we've all been here discussing the importance of the fintech industry as creating jobs, as driving economic growth, driving the economic growth agenda of government. The reason why this conversation is far more important here today is exactly because of the geopolitical tensions that we see, because financial services infrastructure is no longer just important for businesses so that they can trade on a cross-border basis, they can continue their growth journey. It is absolutely critical for the national security, for national sovereignty. And it is absolutely critical that we accelerate the conversation and the collaboration across and amongst all stakeholders, businesses, policymakers, and government, not just now, but as we look ahead.
Yeah, and stablecoins are a key part of that. I know that's part of your business at ClearBank, Mark. I mean, is that something that you're thinking about a lot, the ways that stablecoins can solve fundamental problems rather than just, being a backup for currencies where they can fail?
Yeah, absolutely. So Mark Fairless, CEO of ClearBank, and we were the first new clearing bank for 250 years and provide embedded banking as well, which I could talk for the whole panel about, which I won't. Yeah, so absolutely, I think stablecoins are a really important part of how things are developing. But if I link that to kind of the topic of sovereignty, which you sort of mentioned, I think sovereignty is really important. I think the UK FinTech growth and success there has been, is contributing to economic growth for the UK, which is ultimately the greatest underpin of sovereignty in the long term, particularly in the current climate that we're in. So I think that's really, really important. But then you think about sovereignty in another way, and stablecoins are another, are sort of an example of that. One area where we have sovereignty, and without making it a debate about Brexit, post-Brexit, we have the ability to set our own rules and chart our own course. And I think we should use that in the right way to really embrace the opportunity that stablecoins have. And I think internationally we can see that that's happening. I think, so ClearBank is present in Europe, and we're really kind of using that opportunity that the rules in Europe have provided to move into stablecoins. So I think that's, from a sovereignty perspective, we have from a rule perspective, our fate in our hands, and I think we really need to take that opportunity of the strength of UK FinTech. But then there are other aspects around cloud usage. So we're fully based in the cloud, but if you wanted a UK-based cloud provider, you're going to come up a little bit short, right? And so there is always going to be an international aspect to the businesses that we have. And I think that's one example. Access to capital. We heard the minister talk about that shortly. I think a little while ago. I think that is another way that we can ensure we have sovereignty over what we're doing. So there's lots of shades of that. Stablecoins are one example of that, where I think we really need to move forward, yeah.
And just to double down on that before we move on to other topics, so Iana, maybe this is just one for you. Sovereignty can also come in the form of payment systems, right? Like we've got
100%,
a lot of the other kind of payment networks involved. So outside of stablecoins, we think about even just the dominance of Visa and MasterCard in that sense. How are you thinking about sovereignty for that in terms of your businesses in the UK, your businesses in Europe? Is that something that you're seeing really flourish, or is that something that we're still figuring out?
No, we're absolutely not still figuring this out. I mean, it's very important to acknowledge here that for payment service providers, for fintech firms, ultimately we are here to support the growth journey of our customers. Our customers are digital native businesses, businesses that trade on a cross-border basis, businesses that want to reach customers, potential customers globally. And we have to recognize that ultimately businesses are not interested in the complexity that sits behind. What they're interested in is the speed, the cost, and the reliability of a payment. And therefore, we are now seeing greater and greater adoption of blockchain, the blockchain technology, as well as stable coins and some of the main digital assets as a means of moving and managing money around. Because again, it's all about taking the complexity of that infrastructure, the complexity of payments out for businesses that want to trade on a cross-border basis. And what we have seen over the past, I would say, 36 to 24 months is a growing level of adoption of stable coins for, first of all, cross-border payments, as well as for treasury management services, as well as for ultimately holding of assets, because stablecoins without a doubt are offering the benefit of speed, they're offering the benefit of cost as well, and we see a transition, and ultimately it comes down to that interoperability, so seamless interoperability both from a licensing perspective as well as from a technological perspective. So this is why the conversation that we're having here today and the conversation we were having earlier in the room with the Treasury Secretary and with the FCA is absolutely critical, because we have to ensure that the UK remains a leader in the space, and we will not be able to sustain that position unless we have the right regulatory environment to actually drive that forward. And as a result, actually, we very much welcome the announcement that was made this morning for taking stablecoins out as a means of payments from the wider scope of regulation, so that we can actually continue to incentivize businesses to use stablecoins as a means of cross-border payments.
Right, strong message. And if we move on to talk about some of the other areas of fintech, so we've got lending as well as a key area, I know for both Lisa and for Richard, these are key parts of your businesses. Lisa, why don't I start with you? If we're talking about the instability that we're seeing in the world right now, how is that impacting appetite for lending, particularly among SMEs, your core target audience?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we sometimes forget is the amount of instability that there's been over the last decade. We've been in business now for about 15 years, and over that period we've had Brexit and COVID and cost of living crisis, the Ukraine war, and so this for me is almost in some ways, very much continuation, obviously a worrying continuation of that trend. But I think the businesses that you see today, fintech businesses in general, have been built ground up with that level of resilience. It's much more important in lending, to make sure that as you're making these risk-based decisions, you're making the right decisions. And as such, our business has definitely been through those challenging periods and actually done really well. We've continued to see strong demand. We've continued to deliver strong returns to our institutional investors on the other side of the platform, and extended over £17 billion to SMEs in the UK since we started. So what we're seeing today is really, actually, there is still strong demand. Our institutional investors look at us and see the track record. They still want to deploy money into SMEs in the UK. They see them as the engine room of the economy. And on the SME side, we continue to see strong demand. I think that's due to a couple of things. One is the resilience of these businesses. When I meet the SMEs that we lend to, who are established SMEs, who have been trading for an average 10 years, they've got such grit and resilience. This is their livelihood. This is their own businesses that they've built from the ground up. And so whether it's a chocolate manufacturer diversifying away from cocoa because the prices have gone up, or whether it is beauty salons making the most of the aesthetics trends, they are pivoting, they're entrepreneurial, they're building their businesses. And then the second thing is the innovation that we've created over the last several years to make sure that we're serving all of those needs that SMEs have for financing, both from that investment side with our loans, which was our bread and butter, but also from an ongoing side with lines of credit, with credit cards that support that more working capital need. So we're taking the friction out of all that finance for SMEs so they can focus on running their businesses.
Yeah, and Richard, at Allica Bank, how are you thinking about that matter of efficiency that Lisa was talking about, that where businesses are now having to do more with less money, and so they're having to reposition the way they think about borrowing from a bank like yours? And you know, if we're talking about fintech to 2030 and beyond, how is that factoring into your business model as a bank?
Yeah, so I think first of all, just on the demand point, Q1 for us actually a record by quite some distance. April has been a bit quieter, and I'm not sure the degree to which, as the Iranian sort of crisis drags on, that will start to knock confidence over time. But certainly Q1 didn't see any of that from our point of view. And I think when you talk about businesses doing more with less, I guess also demarcate within the business population those that are growing, those that do have ambition to grow. And in the UK, we need to see more of that sort of risk-taking culture to drive growth. And we need to see funders really backing that. So it's something we've started to measure now. We reported on our annual report that went out last week, and nearly a third of our customers grew their revenue by at least 20% last year, which is massively higher than the UK in general. And we need a lot more of that sort of support for growing businesses, not just zombie businesses, right, that are perhaps stagnating. Clearly, the other thing, right, for doing more for less, I mean, AI, we're well past the point of doubt on AI being a force that will transform the world. And so clearly, if you're a 10-person business, you haven't got roles doing every function under the sun. The ability to use AI to really enhance your business and do more for less is huge.
And that's actually a great segue to talking about the need for transformation. Antony, you're somebody who's been at the head of one of the UK's biggest banks, and then also now you've been running a fintech for the last few years. How are you kind of seeing that transformation journey as fintechs become more well established, more like this, even just this panel here, we could all call you incumbents now rather than startups. How are you seeing that play out, and how do you maintain nimbleness in that journey?
Well, today you find me very much in is the cup half full or half empty mode. Because if I think about the fintech industry and the excellent work that my colleagues on this panel have done and many other companies, in essence, the traditional banking system in this country has never been in better shape. If you look at the share prices of banks, net asset value to share price, it's certainly at an all-time high since the great financial crisis. So although business models are getting traction, I don't think we've yet seen true transformation. And if there's one sort of takeaway from this session, I just think we have to be bolder, right? We have to be bolder and more ambitious, and no disrespect to the economic secretary, to the treasury, but it's not on government, it's on us, right? Government have to create the conditions, we have to do the work. That's the bottom line. And I sort of get a kick out of the stablecoin discussion, because it's like, well, okay, in some contexts, yes, international trade, I get that, but the average person in this country using stablecoin, to do what? However, there are, and this is your point about transformation, there are areas of our society where we could create massive transformation if we deploy these technologies. How many people in this room have bought or sold a property in the last 12 months? Was it a beautifully easy, seamless, cost-free, friction-free process, or was it just a massive pain? It was a massive pain, right? It's a massive pain because we haven't used these technologies to tokenize property assets in this country. If we did that, we could transform that area of the economy, take out the friction, take out the rent-seeking, and create real dynamic energy for, engines for growth. So transformation, I don't think we've seen a lot of it. I think the journey's been a much more linear. I think we need to start creating these transformational opportunities. Find real problems, use technology to solve them, find real opportunities, use technologies to deliver it. But we've got to be very, very focused now because, you know, for me at least, you know, I just don't know what a stable coin's going to do in this country.
Well,
we've got to find some real use cases.
Yeah. I think I probably know what your answer to this last question might be then, but it's one that I'm going to position to everybody else. If we think about what this stage was for a year ago at IFGS, the big topic was listings. How do we get more fintechs to want to build here, scale up here, list here? If you had a magic wand and you wanted to wave it for, you know, one concrete change to regulation or infrastructure in the next 12 to 18 months that would ensure fintechs want to stay in the UK, what would that be? And I'll start with you, Lisa.
I think, and with NERS, we sometimes try and surmise this to what's the one silver bullet we can do. And I think the reality is that that's very difficult to say. There is one thing that is going to change everything as much as we would like it to be. So for me, it's kind of the combination of capital, making sure that we've got the right capital here, policy. We heard the minister talk about actually that engagement, and I totally agree that, you know, what the government's job is to do is to create those conditions, but having policy that does think fintech first might not mean that fintechs get an unfair advantage, but you start from that point and think about what are the innovative models that we want to ensure flourish. And I think too much of the time we focus on the traditional sector. And then finally, regulation that keeps pace. And that's really hard. Regulatory environments, I think we've done a really good job several years ago when we were starting out of creating these FCA sandboxes. What I think is very difficult is then to support those businesses as they scale up. And we've seen that take a lot longer than I think anyone would have liked to with some of the recent regulatory approvals. So for me, it's kind of the combination of those things that will help us over this next decade to continue to be the global hub for fintech, as Janine said.
Emily, if I may, I'd like to answer your question in a slightly different way. We tend to often focus on what's not there, what's missing, what needs to change, what requires improvement. I'd like to actually take the next minute or so to give a shout out to the environment that we have, because it wasn't that long ago, I think it was at last year's summit and the summit before, we were sitting here and having the debate as to whether the Middle East is going to be the next hub for fintech. And we tend to forget that actually the resilience and the stability and the security and the sustainability that we have from both regulatory perspective, political standpoint, as well as from a technological standpoint that we have here in the UK and in London is incredibly important. So we actually, yes, can do more when it comes to reform in the pension sector so that we can drive more capital towards scale businesses that need to scale up. Yes, we can absolutely do that, and we have to do that. But again, let's take a moment to recognize that we have great talent here in the UK. We have great expertise, great legacy, as well as great drive from the different stakeholders, policymakers, and government to actually continue to champion the fintech agenda.
And I agree with everything that's been said there. I think I'd also, in the last 12 months, recognise the amount of additional support and change, the volume of changes that have been announced. You know, we have the support of the government for fintech, and I think recognising that is important. I think with the Leeds reforms we've had, with the announcements this morning, there's lots of examples of things that we can point to where, as part of the growth agenda or whatever you sort of want to call it, the government recognise that UK FinTech is a strength, and they are doing everything that they can to support us. So I think, you know, continue that, right? It would be my ask. I think that positive open dialogue about how we can continue to set the right tone and the right foundations for all of us to innovate and grow from is fantastic, and of course stablecoins. Is
there anything you wish would move faster, especially on stablecoins? That's been one of the criticisms, right? Yeah,
I think so. I think there's lots of positive dialogue happening on stablecoins, and I know there's different views maybe on the panel of what the use cases of those are, I kind of think of it more as a payment rail rather than a consumer product. I think that's how I would think about it. And the use case being kind of into cross-border international payments, cheaper, quicker, more transparent. There's lots of things there, but absolutely right. The speed of change is the fastest it's ever been. Whether that's AI, whether that's stable coins, we need to make sure that the regulatory environment keeps pace.
So, I mean, I do agree there's a lot of good things. I'm going to go for the question itself, which was what do we need to really do? And we must get net inflows of capital to public equity markets in the UK. I mean, that's fintech, it's wider, and the pension funds are a vital part of that, and not enough has happened so far. I mean, there's been a lot of good initiatives and talk. It needs to convert to action.
Short and sweet. I mean, Antony, do you want to give an answer? I kind of cut you off. So.
Yeah, just to kind of tie it all together, right? If you come back to this global instability point, the phrase du jour now is the middle powers. You know, we're clearly not an economy the size of the US. We don't have the growth rates of places like China and India, and that position is only going to sustain over time. But the one thing about software is global. And I do a lot of business outside the UK, much more than I do in the UK, actually. So I spend a lot of time in other places in the world seeing what's going on there. But if you want to build great software that solves real problems, you need two things. You need financial capital, you need human capital. And both those things are ecosystems. So yes, we need the pension fund and all the stuff my colleagues talked about, but I'm also fascinated in how we can better harness the power of our world-class universities to solve some of these problems and provide that human capital, because we are very rich in that human capital here in the UK. And so I really want to double down on how do we help our world-class universities power this position that we have through human capital.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you all for speaking on the panel. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope everybody else in the room did too.